Whilst the city of Manchester sailed across the Atlantic in pursuit of Muller, the press back home in London found that they had a public hungry for news and very little hard facts to feed them. Instead, they turned to editorialising on the guilt of Muller to continue to stimulate their circulation, with almost all reports skewing negatively against him. Rumours of the ship Victoria were cast out daily with little rhyme or reason, and very little truth. Muller was reported on as an assassin, and reminders that capital punishment awaited him were in almost every paper. In general, the British public had accepted German immigration into England with a relative indifference. However, with the outbreak of Germany's war against the British ally of Denmark in the early months of 1864, a sea change of opinion against German immigrants had found attitudes and prejudices changing, and they were not in favour of Muller. At the same time, a statement was delivered at the inquest from a Mr. Lee. Lee was a friend of Thomas Briggs and had travelled on the same line regularly. He had had some hesitation in coming forward, on account that on the night of the murder he was visiting a young lady who was not his wife. After he officially came forward, this was documented as Lee simply taking a walk. Lee's story was curious. He had seen Briggs on the train just before his murder, and he had said goodnight to him as he walked past his carriage on the platform. But more strangely is that Lee claimed to have also seen two other men in the carriage, men who were not there when the train arrived, sans Briggs, in Hackney. Police asked Lee to describe the men, and neither description matched that of Muller. Still time passed, and still the press printed their stories. Subtle changes were happening, however, and now, bolstered by Lee's statement, the press began to change their tact. Details of Matthews began to leak out, that he was recently bankrupt, and that his cab was unlicensed, along with the details of his past legal run-ins. Questions began falling upon his own motives for coming forward to police. Was he spinning a yarn hoping to collect the reward money? Or perhaps was he even an accomplice of Muller? The Daily Telegraph even published an article that warned the public against prematurely judging Muller, and the Daily Mail wrote that evidence rendered his guilt extremely improbable. No wise and cautious man would dare to say at present that Muller cannot be innocent. The police too found themselves coming under the firing line for their glaring incapacity and clod-hopping blundering, calling into question their £500,000 yearly budget. Mercifully, the city of Manchester pulled into New York on the 5th of August, allowing for new news to take the fore. The ship the detectives had travelled on was so quick across the ocean, however, that they had a full 3 weeks of waiting, time enough for extradition preparations to be outlined. Finally, Muller's Victoria came into sight on the horizon on the evening of the 25th of August. Inspector Tanner and Inspector Kersey, who had followed Tanner to New York 2 days after he left, were waiting on the docks after alerting pilot boats to the details of the incoming passenger, warning them against the possibility of escaping passengers and reminding them they weren't to mention anything about Muller to be sure he would not be alerted to the police lying in wait for his arrival. After the ship docked, Tanner went aboard and the captain sent 2 armed guards to follow Muller discreetly. The passengers were called for a quarantine check, and when Muller's name was called out and he stepped forward, Tanner took him to one side and arrested him for the willful murder of Thomas Briggs on the North London line. Far from acting panicked, Muller said simply that he was never on the line and he had no idea who Briggs was. The police took him to his room where they assembled a makeshift lineup and called for Death, who pointed out and identified Muller immediately as the man who had come into his shop. When they searched Muller's personal items, the inspectors found both the gold watch that had belonged to Thomas Briggs and a silk top hat matching the description of the one Briggs often wore. Muller claimed that he had bought the hat on the used market over a year ago, and the watch, he claimed, had been bought back at the docks in London. It was not the most convincing story, and whilst he remained calm, Muller must have realised the predicament he was now in. He was taken ashore and the extradition process began. During the extradition hearing, which opened on the 26th of July, Muller was defended by Chauncey Schaefer, a verbose and flamboyant attorney with a good record of defending difficult criminal cases. "You could always rely on Schaefer to provide good copy," remarked the press. Schaefer lived up to expectations, opening the proceedings by claiming that the extradition was invalid and that any treaty between America and England were no longer applicable. "England and the United States are in a war, an undeclared war, but nonetheless a state of war, a mixed and unsolemn state of war, as Grotius defined it. A state of things that, by the common consent of mankind, suspends all treaties between the two countries concerned. England cannot say she is neutral when she furnishes our rebellious subjects with vessels of war, opens her ports to them, furnishes them with arms and ammunition, and sends them forth on their errands of destruction." Schaefer steered a steady course throughout the hearing, ramping up his speech and underlining all manner of Anglo-American disagreements, aiming to exploit the tensions between the countries, all to great public amusement and applause. At one point, he pointed to Inspector Tanner and damned the English for "murdering our citizens, destroying our commerce, and humiliating our nation. England must come into court with clean hands. She must not come here and ask of us to honour her justice when she dishonours her own, breaks her treaties and cries peace and neutrality while at the same time she lets slip the dogs of war." The crowded courthouse loved it. Schaefer had certainly given good copy. It was not enough, however, and once evidence had been given as to the guilt of Muller, his extradition was granted. Whilst the papers had a field day with Schaefer's speeches, they commented on Muller as vacant and indifferent, stating that he was surely either a simpleton or an innocent man to have remained so calm. The now sizable party of Tanner, Kerosy, Death, Matthews and Muller sailed back to England on the 1st of September aboard the ship Etna. They docked in Liverpool 15 days later on the 16th of September to much excitement. The public were finally to catch a glimpse of this most foul murderer that they had heard so much about. When they arrived, there was a suitable crowd vying to catch a glimpse of Muller. Quite aside from the monster they were expecting, however, he appeared like most other young men. After the hype of the press during their time at sea, his appearance was not much more than a disappointment. The press remarked that he had seemed quiet and cheerful, and on the return journey to England under the surveillance of Inspector Tanner, who he had roomed with for the whole journey, he had shown exemplary behaviour, so far that no form of restraint or handcuffs were found necessary. The party fought through the crowds awaiting their arrival, and the police took Muller to Bow Street to be formally charged and then placed him in a cell in Holloway Prison to await trial. Whilst no one had seen Muller aboard the train, or indeed in any of the stations along the North London line on the night of the murder, the weight of the circumstantial evidence appeared to stack heavily against Muller. His possession of both hat and watch that had belonged to Thomas Briggs were damning indeed, and his life was very much on the line. Muller, it turned out, however, had something of an alibi. The trial began on the 27th of October. The German Legal Protection Society, an organisation led by a group of influential German immigrants, paid for Franz Muller's defence, and as soon as the proceedings opened, the courtroom was filled. Public interest was such that the Solicitor General, who opened the case for the prosecution, warned the jury, "This is a case which has excited unusual and painful interest. It is one which, as we all know, has been canvassed in almost every newspaper, I might say in almost every house in the kingdom, and it is one on which some persons might be inclined already to form an opinion. I must entreat you, gentlemen, in approaching this most solemn inquiry, to discard from your minds anything that you may have read on the subject." The prosecution laid down the evidence against Muller with concise precision. The beaver hat left behind by the culprit had been one of only 4 made by the hatmaker Walker that included that specific lining, one other being that which was owned by Matthews. This meant that if this was not the hat that belonged to Muller, it was one of only 2 others. The top hat found in Muller's possession in New York aboard the Victoria was found to have more than superficial similarities to that of Briggs's hat. Digence, the hat maker, testified that he had stuffed the lining with tissue paper to create a better fit for Thomas Briggs. And despite the hat owned by Muller having been cut down by about 1.5 inches, it did indeed show evidence of having been lined with tissue paper. The crude cutting down of the hat was not the job of a hat maker, who would have glued the seams, it was heard, but having been stitched back together, it was rather a job that a tailor might employ. Briggs Jr. was brought out to identify the watch found on Muller's person, and he claimed without hesitation that it was his father's, absolutely unmistakable, with serial numbers to back it up. The defence opened with a strong damning of the press's handling of the story in the lead up to the trial, and went on to question Matthews, pointing out that in the past he had lied willfully before a coroner and magistrate, and the likelihood that his motives for coming forward were entirely based upon profiting from the reward. The long speech also drew attention to the fact that no blooded clothing was ever found on Muller, that he wore the same clothing the day after the murder as he was wearing on the day of. A small issue that, as slight as he was, it was highly doubtful that Muller could have carried out the attack against the 5'9" Briggs in under 3 minutes, including carrying his body to the doorway and tossing him out onto the opposite tracks. You can see for yourselves that I am not describing this wrongly when I say that the prisoner is a young man possessed of no great amount of physical force. His physique is slight in the extreme. It is proved that Mr. Briggs was perfectly sober, and it is said that he was sleeping. Now, gentlemen, you have to say whether you can form an opinion as to whether that struggle, which ended in the death of a powerful, sober man, could have been sustained by the young man at the bar. If you believe in your own minds and consciences that this young man, with the physique that he has, and which you yourselves can see, could not have murdered Mr. Briggs, then you will acquit him. Mr. Lee was called to the witness stand and reiterated his story concerning the 2 men he had seen in the carriage with Briggs on the night of his murder, and then the defence pulled their ace. Muller had been earlier suffering from an injury caused by a passing cart running into his foot. During the days of the murder, he was often seen to be wearing a slipper on the injured foot rather than a shoe, and the defence called a bus conductor who had seen a man wearing a slipper on his foot at 9:50 p.m. on the night of the murder, the exact time the killer would have been in the carriage in North London. Though he was not able to swear it was Muller, and he could not identify him, he swore that he had seen the slippered man board the bus in Camberwell in South London. Backing this story up was a deaf woman named Mary Ann Eldred, who was something of a sweetheart of Muller's, and her landlady, Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones told the court how Muller had called in on Mary Ann at 9 p.m. on the night of Thomas Briggs' murder, and told him that Mary Ann wasn't home. She then spent 10 minutes talking to him, and this bolstered the claim that he was boarding the bus in Camberwell at the time of the murder. The defence also warned the jury to forget their prejudice against German immigrants. Whilst this seemed like a strong defence, it was yet more circumstantial evidence. Worse was the misjudgment of the public mood in regards to German immigrants. Far from finding empathy, the outcome was more of a doubling down on previous opinion. It also turned out that Mary Ann Eldred was a prostitute, and that Mrs. Jones, rather than a landlady per se, was something more akin to a brothel owner. Once these facts were uncovered, they had quite a damaging effect against the defence's speech. Muller's trial lasted for 3 days in total. The jury was out for a mere 15 minutes with reference to before the verdict was returned, and the court found Muller guilty for the murder of Thomas Briggs. I have no more doubt that you committed this murder than I have with reference to the occurrence of any other event of which I am certain, but which I did not see with my own eyes. Muller's sentence was handed down and was to be public execution by hanging. In 1864, defendants weren't allowed to speak in their defence. This was the first time the court heard him. I am satisfied with the sentence which your lordship has passed. I know very well that it is what the law of the country prescribes. What I have to say is that I have not been convicted on a true statement of the facts, but on a false statement. Muller was then led away to await execution. In the days leading to the public execution of Franz Muller, Several petitions were lodged against the verdict by the German Legal Protection Society, including a visit to the Briggs' house to convince Briggs' family to sign. It was, however, an invitation that was swiftly denied. Several times Muller met with a priest who tried to convince him to confess to his crimes, which he did not do, and finally, on the morning of the 14th of November, Muller stood on the scaffold outside the Old Bailey, noose tied around his neck. The priest gave him one final chance to confess his crimes, and as the scaffold creaked and lurched into action, Muller spoke his final words in German. Ich habe es getan. I did it. The case of Thomas Briggs and the conviction of Franz Muller lingered for a while. Questions were raised and many were left unanswered. Slowly it petered out of the public's mind. Matthews collected his reward, and several proposals to make trains safer for passengers were discussed in Parliament, eventually leading to the implementation of emergency brake cables in carriages. Muller's final confession appears to wrap the case up on the side of the good. However, to anyone reading today, there are serious questions on the side of both Muller's guilt and innocence. Mr. Lee's story remains high on the list, along with Muller's alibi. Free from the prejudice of Victorian England, we can measure its credibility with less bias. On the flip side, how would Muller come into possession of Thomas Briggs' hat and watch if he had not murdered him himself? Was Muller naive in the extreme by telling everyone of his trip to America, including even the name of the ship he was to sail on, and buying a ticket in his own name? Or was he simply an innocent man, not aware that his actions might later be seen as a guilty man running from justice? His final confession stamps a finality on the affair, but for those that fall on the side of judging him innocent, remains a cryptic thing to have said, if he said it at all.